You know how some days just start the right way? You know it's going to be a great day. Today is one of those days because there were more than 70 drones that reached the Moscow region. There is a major scandal now coming out from the central bank that shows that the Russian economy is becoming highly destabilized. And more than that, other economic indicators have now come out to show that the economy is far worse than what we knew before. And all at the same time, there are domestic concerns and unrest in various parts of Russia. So let's dig right into it. Let's start off with the July 7th memo that finally came out from the Central Bank of Russia. What they want to do is issue a ton of new rubles. In fact, about 15 trillion new rubles. That's about $180 billion by October. Now, what's incredible about this is that this is the largest amount that they've issued since 1998. This represents a monetary base expansion of approximately 40% over 2024 levels. This can be done mostly with the 1,000 and the 5,000 ruble notes. And the purpose of this, according to the central bank, is to stabilize liquidity and fund, quote, urgent fiscal priorities. What they mean is defense spending, or actually offense spending. But domestic bond servicing is part of this, as is ruble stabilization and intervention in the Russian economy. And the reason for that is very simple. Russia's economy is a total basket case. So money supplies in Russia have grown in M2 from 870 billion in early 2022 to 1.56 trillion in mid 2025. That's a 56% increase relative to GDP. What that means is this expansion is going to exceed the underlying output growth, which is create long-term inflationary pressure. They're just going to drive up inflation. Because what we know is that rapid monetary expansion without productivity gains leads to currency depreciation. This will lead to real wage depreciation, erosion, and the conversion of ruble assets into durable foreign goods becoming impossible. Reducing the ruble's domestic utility as a store of value is also going to be impossible. Russia is putting itself into a situation where it's going to make its own economy far worse just because it wants to pay for this war. And the normal Russians are going to feel this. Now, officially, the inflation rate's just less than 10%. A lot of economists say it's probably somewhere in the 20s, but neither here nor there. Look at how the average Russian is living today. Critical things, food, fuel, pharmaceuticals, their prices have gone up 14, 18% year over year. Some things have gone up more than 200% since 2022. The average person, are they making lots more money? No, in fact, growth of wages in Russia remains about 8% or less. Where that's a problem is inflation officially is just less than 10%. So if your salary increases by even 8%, which would be great in Russia, you're actually not making more money. You're losing more money than you were from the year before because inflation's eating up that extra profit. So overall, we see this is not just something limited, though, to consumers. We see that the markets within Russia, the business environment in Russia, is becoming a total disaster. So check out the statistic. In quarter one, 2025, corporate interest payments totaled $49 billion. That's a 58% increase year over year. At the same time, overdue corporate debt rose from $28 billion to $31 billion, an 11% increase in delinquency. Lending during this whole period has also contracted because both the lenders and the borrowers are trying to get out of the credit market. Interest rates remain at 20%, and inflation adjusted rates are near zero or negative in some sectors. So, what we see here is quite interesting. We see dual compression. We see firms that are losing access to capital, but consumers are also losing real income. So, this is going to slow down the investment, kill the consumption simultaneously, but it also is going to increase the coming stagflation. And that inflation is leading to something else. It's leading to insolvency. So consider how the government's doing. How are they weathering the storm? Well, the federal deficit for January to February 2025 was $35 billion. That's a 139% increase year over year. It's a disaster. And where they're getting money from now is the National Welfare Fund. That is supposed to be there to pay for the pensions. Well, no, they've taken the money out of that. And now they're having denominated bond issuances and other things, but those rubles have no value. So where is this money going to come from to pay for the pensions in Russia or to pay for the hospitals in Russia? The liquid assets of the National Welfare Fund have decreased dramatically because the government keeps stealing from it. They've taken out from the 125 billion that was there in 2022. Today, it's looking like there's only about 45 billion left. And it looks like by next year, they would have burnt through the rest of it. That's simply phenomenal. So by some point in 2026, they will not have money anymore for the pensions and the other parts of the government or other parts of society that depend on the government's National Welfare Fund. This looks bad, but it gets worse when you look at how it's affecting other parts of the country, how it's affecting other parts of Russia. Specifically, let's look at what's happening with the banks. So on June 6th, the Central Bank of Russia reduced its key rate from 21 to 20%. That's despite the fact that inflation is exceeding 9%. Now, the rationale that they gave at the time was that it was targeted support and it was to help the war affected parts of the economy. It was to improve the credit flow. Under standard monetary conditions, a central bank would raise interest rates to combat inflation. But what they're doing here is they're just desperate for liquidity. They need more liquidity. And what they're doing is a trade off, essentially. They're trading off monetary expansion at the risk of ruble credibility. And that is a real risk because today the ruble is losing value. In fact, some economists have estimated in Russia that before the end of this year, we might see the ruble lose 50% of its value because the government, in order to pay all of its debts, to keep its books in order, will need to devalue their currency. So, how's an average person who's had an 8% pay increase this year, so he's doing unusually well, survive when 50% of his money just disappears? Russians don't have a lot of liquidity. They're not loaded. This is something that they can't just recover from. They don't just bounce back from this. And the central bank is sort of stuck because it ultimately is taking political orders, which is always a dangerous thing. You want the central bank to be independent, so it's not being used for political ploys. In the case of Russia, though, of course, Putin gets what he wants. And so when they want to spend more money or they want to print more rubles, that's what they do. And that's why today the central bank's balance sheets, it's been absorbing more and more volume of the government bonds through both the direct purchase and the repo operations. This is reducing the independence and shifting the institution into becoming sort of a fiscal role. It's no longer operating as a normal, neutral, or independent central bank. And sustaining this for a period of time, things will get worse. Because look at other parts of the private sector. We see that the government, in order to try to free up the private sector to have it be able to go out and do more business, decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to raise the corporate rate on taxes. So profits in Russia now are getting taxed higher than they were before. There's a 25% increase in the amount of tax that corporations have to pay as of July 1st of this year. How's that going to affect the economy? How's that going to affect the increasing number of businesses that say they cannot cope with the current economic situation? Keeping in mind that in quarter one of this year, 70,000 small and mid-sized firms requested debt restructuring. 34% of businesses in Russia report worsening economic situations, worsening operating conditions, and the lowest sentiment index since the full-scale war began. People are totally unhappy. They're very concerned. We see other parts of the economy are collapsing, such as the real estate market, construction markets, and what those both have in common is they deal a lot with the banks. People are doing serious real estate development. Obviously, you're taking out loans from the banks. And if they now are going bust because people aren't buying properties and properties are rapidly losing value, it means they're not going to pay back the banks. So all this goes around in circles. Keep in mind, VTB Bank, one of the largest in Russia, it reported that loan delinquencies reached 5% in May 2025. That's up from 3.5% just a couple months before. Spear Banks, which is another major Russian banks, mortgage defaults are also rising quickly. So much so they've had to issue a statement. So that's not a good sign. It looks quite serious. Well, it certainly is. And that's why the Bank of Russia classifies over 9.5% of all household loans as, quote, at risk. The IMF typically flags systematic concerns when it sees a threshold of 8%. This is 9.5%. So this is not just, cherry picking. This is data across all of the Russian economy that shows that things are getting worse and worse. And consider this simultaneously, there's other things going wrong for Putin. And as always in these videos, I have pages more of information that I was hoping to discuss, but we're almost out of time. Is look at what is happening right now in different parts of the country, namely the parts that are Muslim majority, such as South Ossetia. Look what's happening right now in Chechnya. There's been an increase of fighting, domestic strife, and that fighting is creating real problems. And one of the reasons creating real problems in a very direct sense, and one of the reasons that you'll probably not hear from a lot of other people, but worth considering, is that Vladimir Putin is very dependent on things like the Chechens for being his right hand. They are there to protect him. They're to be his loyal front. But today they've got their own problems. We've seen they've got, within Chechnya, very significant problems. Named as Kadyrov, their leader, it appears to be dying. He seems to be expiring. And as a result of that, it's going to be left to his son. But his son doesn't have absolute control. He doesn't have exactly what his father had. And if that region, where there's a lot of people that want to have independence, were to turn against Putin or not wish to support him, that's a disaster for Putin's own personal security. Because within Moscow, for a long time, they've had a lot of Chechens that the government kept there specifically to protect Putin if anything went wrong. Why? Because the Russians calculated that perhaps the Chechens would be willing to fire on the Russian people, where the Russian soldiers might not be willing to. So when we look at Russia today, we see just one disaster after another. The increase of terrorism within their own country, civic strife within their own country, the drone attacks increasing by Ukraine on Moscow. Major airports again were closed down today in Russia thanks to Ukrainian drones, which leads me to say this is from our friends at the 505, whom we gave more drones to. If you'd like to help us send more drones to Ukraine to help the Ukrainian soldiers fight, here's some more of our patches. Please do. I'll put a link in the first comment below and we'll pin it. So when we see these situations, we see the economy, we see the banking sector, we see the private individuals in the country, we see the small businesses, we see the large businesses. There is nothing to look forward to in Russia. Things are truly getting out of control. So as of right now, things are looking very grim for Vladimir Putin. And the most incredible part is that every day he is making more decisions to make his own future worse. And he probably doesn't even realize it. And that's why regimes like Vladimir Putin's have a tendency of ending very unexpectedly, but very quickly. Just one violent day. Thank you for watching. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.